My name is Frank Kodak, and today, July 13th, 2014, I am delighted to have the opportunity to speak not only with a respected law librarian and past president of the American Association of Law Libraries, but also a dear friend. James E. Duggan is the director of the Law Library and associate professor of law at Tulane University Law School in New Orleans, Louisiana. Our conversation is part of the Oral History of Law Librarianship project, a component of the Spinelli Law Library Reference Shelf on Hine Online. The setting for this conversation is the Hine Suite at the Marriott River Center Hotel in San Antonio, the site of the 2014 annual meeting of the American Association of Law Libraries. James, it is a great pleasure for me to speak with you today about your life and career as a law librarian.
Thanks, Frank. It's a great pleasure to be here, not only with Pat, but also a treat to have you doing the interview.
My pleasure. Let's begin by learning a little about you personally. Can you tell us about your early life, where you were raised, your family background, and what your childhood was like?
Well, I was born in Roanoke, Virginia. I grew up with two brothers, a twin brother who's 3 minutes older, and an older brother who's 13 months older. And I attended schools in Roanoke City. We moved to Danville, Virginia for a year, and then came back to Roanoke County, where I attended the rest of elementary school and high school, and finished up in 1979. And my family life was idyllic childhood in many ways. My mother was a stay-at-home mom, and she allowed us to play all the time, and that's the one thing that I really was most appreciative of, was being able to run roughshod all over the neighborhood, and just getting called in for dinner, especially in the summer when we were out of school.
Very good.
So I enjoy that very much.
Great. What do you like to do when you're not working? What are some of your hobbies, passions, pursuits outside of law librarianship?
It's a trick question. I really don't have very many passions outside of law librarianship. Frankly, law librarianship, sadly to say, is most of my life. I do read mysteries. I'm a big mystery fan, especially the classics, Christie, Allingham, and the like. But for the most part, it seems like I just get up, go to work, and then come home and go to bed.
Well, as we will see as we go through this conversation, you're doing lots of things, so it's undoubtedly takes up plenty of your time. Well, so now we know a little bit about your personal life. Can you tell us about your educational and professional training and perhaps your early career aspirations?
Well, after high school, I went to Virginia Tech and got a Bachelor's of Art in Education. My plan was to become a social studies teacher. My major plan was to go to law school, but I wanted to make sure I had a fallback plan, and the fallback plan was to teach social studies. So I finished college, got my teaching certificate, and in the meantime applied to law school and got in. So the plan worked. Went to law school at the University of Mississippi. It was a bit of a challenge for me. I'd never been out of Virginia before, except on vacations, and to go to a whole new state with whole new challenges was very interesting and exciting for me.
How did you happen to choose Ole Miss? Why did you leave the state?
Well, after college, I didn't have very much money, so I looked around for what the cheapest law school I could attend was. And Ole Miss at the time did not have an application fee, and they were also pretty darn inexpensive for an out-of-state student. I think at the time, this would have been in 1983, an out-of-state student paid double the in-state tuition rate, which at the time was $600, so I was paying $1,500.
Wow.
Which was one of the reasons why I went to Ole Miss, was because it was relatively inexpensive.
Very good.
And at Ole Miss, I was hired by the acting head of public services at the time, Ann Fessenden, on my first day of law school in the library. I needed a job. I had worked all through college. I knew I was going to need to work in law school as well. So first day I went up to the library and put in my application. I had never worked in a library before, but I'd thought about it off and on. And the biggest concern I had about even working as a library is I did not want to learn the Dewey Decimal System. And fortunately, as I discovered when I got to law schools, they didn't have the Dewey Decimal System. They had the Library of Congress system, at least at that library. And I thought, well, I can do this as long as I don't have to learn the various humanities and things like that.
I'm
It's gonna be
impressed that
fun.
you were able to distinguish between the Dewey Decimal System and the Library of Congress system. What you've talked about so far is a very good segue into the next thing I wanted to explore, and that is how your career in law librarianship developed. How and when did you decide to become a law librarian? We know you started in a law library on day one of law school, but did that immediately translate into, hey, what about law librarianship or profession, or did someone recruit you into the profession?
Not immediately, but I will say that after Ann hired me, I met many of the rest of the staff there, including Chad Bunnell, who was her husband at the time, and Tom Steele was the director of the
Tom
library at that time. And as I went through law school the first year, I liked law school very much, but I grew sort of disenchanted with some of the practices, especially in Mississippi in the mid-'80s. It was still somewhat a provincial state, and I got really annoyed when people kept calling me a Yankee, even though I was from Virginia. And it sort of suggested that perhaps geography wasn't their strong point, at least some of my fellow students. But I started doing loosely filing in the law library and gradually worked my way up to a reference assistant. In fact, that first year they left me in charge of the reference desk while most of the librarians went to AALL. And that was either a great mistake or a sign of trust. Whatever happened, I got through it, and I gradually thought, this is not a bad job. I enjoyed learning about all the sources that were necessary for doing legal research, and gradually I thought, as my second year and started to think about what I was going to do with my third year, that perhaps law librarianship wasn't bad. At the time, Tom Steele had left, and we had hired Wes Cochran as the director of the library, and I chatted him on several times about law librarianship as a career and what schools might I go to, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, Wes being Wes, he immediately put in a plug for the University of Washington and the program there. And I looked at it, and it
Wes being a graduate of the Washington program.
Right. He was a
law librarianship program
there. And I looked at the program and thought, I'm just not going to be able to afford to swing going to the University of Washington, because it was I think at the time it was a 1.5-year program, or almost 2 years, and you had a fieldwork requirement. And it was way the heck out on the West Coast, and I just couldn't see how I could afford to move up there and live there. So, being a resident of Virginia still, I was still considered an out-of-state resident, I began to look at library schools that were within the Virginia consortium that would give in-state tuition. And I applied to several of them and got into all of them, but the one that gave me an assistantship was LSU. So in Louisiana. So I decided my third year I was going to just go to library school right after law school. I joined AALL in 1985 during my second year of law school. So
you were a student
I was a student member. They still had pretty reasonable rates back then, and I think it was $20 a year or something like that, and so I was able to join and get the mailings and learn more about the profession itself. So after I graduated from law school, I made plans to move to LSU and start library school there, which I did. And at library school, I started as a research assistant in the law library. At the time, working under Madeline Hebert, who was the reference librarian there, and Charlotte Emilius, who was the circulation librarian, and Lance Dixon, who of course was the director. And I learned an awful lot. Not only was it my first experience with civil law in Louisiana, having come from Commonwealth State.
Though, as we know.
Apparently not going to be my last, but I enjoyed learning about Louisiana law and meeting one of my absolute best friends in law librarianship, Mary Wisner, who was a fellow research assistant at the time.
And at that time, she was also attending the LSU.
She was in the LSU Library School program as well, and she had gotten a AALL scholarship the year before to go to library school, and she very kindly helped me with my application so that I could get a ALL scholarship while in library school. So I was just thrilled to be able to eat um, with my graduate assistantship and also the scholarship from AALL. That was really important to me because it made me feel that the profession wanted me in a lot of ways. So I was thrilled to get it. I also at the time joined the local chapter, NOAL, while in library school, and was a recipient of NOAL grants to go to the AALL meeting in 1987, which was my first meeting
In
in
Chicago.
Chicago. And I had put off taking the bar exam while I was going to library school, but I took it the next year. So I went to the 1987 Chicago convention and started interviewing while I was in my last year of library school. And then 3 weeks later, I took the bar exam in Mississippi. And
Wow.
I was one of the stupidest things I've ever done, but fortunately I passed the bar exam.
Congratulations.
Was
It's not
able-
usually what I advise
No,
law
and
students
it's
to
what
do.
I tell students now, don't put it off like that. But I do recall, I was in summer school, planning to go to AALL and also studying for the bar at the same time. It was a really, really busy summer. So my first experience at AALL was just mind-opening. All meeting people left and right who were just big names, luminaries in the profession at the time. And I wasn't able to go to Connell that year, but I went the next year and just learned so much about the profession that I realized I had found a home.
Excellent. Well, so now you've passed the bar, you've attended your first ALL annual meeting, but now you need permanent employment. So you began job searches, and I know this very well since I was the one who hired you. Your first full-time professional position was as a reference librarian and assistant professor at Southern Illinois University School of Law in Carbondale, which is further north than either Mississippi or Virginia. You began in March 1988. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your impressions and experiences in that first professional position?
Well, before I started, I had 3 requirements for a job. I didn't want to go anywhere where they had more than 3 continuous lanes of highways going in one direction. I was really not interested in large cities, so Carbondale really fit the bill because
This is true.
they may have had 3 lanes going in one direction, but there wasn't a whole lot of traffic there. Secondly, they had to have a Kroger store, which was at the time a popular grocery emporium.
And we still have one.
Okay, and third, I was looking for a place where I could have a mentor, and certainly Southern Illinois fit that bill to a T. It was incredible how at the time that I got the offer from SIU, I'd also had an offer from another school, and I had basically 3 days to make up my mind which one I wanted to do. And I recall thinking, okay, this is not that difficult. I knew which place, really just based on the size of the town and the people I'd met, that I was going to pick you guys at Southern Illinois.
Wow.
So I started there in March, and it really sort of solidified what I had thought all along about law librarianship, that whether it's firm, whether it's academic, whether it's court, it's a place where I can make a difference and I can learn so much about what it means to be productive as a professional. So started there and really thought initially I would be there for no more than 3 years, that I would move on with my career and I'd learn what I could do and then take what I had from that and then just keep going, because I thought at the time, my goal is to be a director. And I thought that it doesn't have to happen right away, but it's something that eventually would be a nice thing to do.
Very good. Well, on behalf of all the SIU students that you worked with and the SIU faculty and staff, all I can say is I'm glad we had that Kroger there to attract you to Carbondale. So we're going to take you through some of what you did, because obviously you did not stay there for 3 years. It was 20 years. So in 1990, a couple years after joining our library faculty at SIU, you became part of what I consider a pioneering group of law librarians by shifting your position from reference to computer services. And you continued in that role through 1997 when you were promoted to Director of Information Technology and professor at SIU, a position you held from 1998 to 2006. Can you reflect a little bit on what it meant to be on the ground floor, really, of this kind of new area of law librarianship?
Well, certainly personal computers were still in their infancy back in the late 80s. We had them. We were going from, really, we had just gone from the 8.5 diskettes to more the 3.5 or the
Right.
6.5, I guess, 6.25 floppy disks, and then eventually to 3.5 disks. But gradually it dawned on me that I was very good at being able to turn the computer back on after it failed, and that sort of suggested that maybe I had some skill in working with computers, because half the time when a computer would fail, obviously you just reboot it, and that seemed to correct a lot of things. But I learned more and more about that and could see, as you could, as my director, that computers were taking much more of the practice of law by storm, and we needed to be part of that. So in 1990, we built our first computer lab at Southern Illinois University. It was part of a farmed out turnkey operation, but then I was in charge of it. So I had to learn about all the various programs that we were putting on there, and how to keep them up to date, and how to train law students in using them, because many of them had never used a word processing program before. And I can remember that initially we were doing a lot of that sort of basic training for students. So that happened, and I gradually was one of the first people to go to Cali, the Center for Computer Assisted Legal Instruction, when they had their first meeting in the early 90s up in Chicago. And I think I was probably someone who went to the first, must have been 10 or 11 of them in a row. So I got to know an awful lot of computer people that way, and learned about the new trends, et cetera, that were there. Now, I said I was going to be there for 3 years, but it was because of you giving me these opportunities that I was able to stay at Southern Illinois, yet grow in the profession, because I had a new job, basically every 3 or 5 years, and that was something that kept it fresh.
So you didn't feel stale?
I didn't feel stale. I didn't have an eye roving to look around, and gradually I decided that there's really not a whole reason to go somewhere else as long as I'm continuing to learn and continuing to have the mentoring process that you were providing.
In addition to attending Cali and obviously working at SIU, you became very active in the computing services special interest
SIS,
section.
right. Well as in AALL, just in general, right. And that was one of the ways to get involved in. And I remember you telling me that you wanted to support activity in AALL, and however you did that, that was fine. So I joined the Social Responsibilities SIS and the Computing Services SIS, and a bunch of other SISs as well, and started becoming much more active there, as well as writing. In addition to that, we did more programs before, and the one story that I'd like to suggest on camera is that traveling with you is always an experience, especially on the road when we would go to various regional chapter meetings as well as ALL. And I can remember the time you were involved in cataloging project of AALL annual meeting tapes.
Oh, yes.
And so normal people, when you would travel, would listen to the radio or maybe chat. We would be listening to ALL tapes the entire time.
Recordings. Well, you can't index those recordings if you don't know what they're about.
That's true, but it also makes for an incredibly long car ride, especially when you're learning about something that you didn't necessarily want to go to the program when you were at the meeting to begin with. But nonetheless,
But it broadened your knowledge.
It broadened my knowledge.
Prepared you for bigger and better, I'm sure.
Perhaps.
Perhaps.
I'll say that.
One of the other things that you did at SIU that I would assume also allowed you to get into new things was you developed a whole new course that we'd never offered, as while many schools were offering advanced legal research, which essentially was just teaching things like administrative law and legislative history, which we actually taught in the first year, your course was advanced electronic legal research, where you took up where we left off in the first year and presented not only Westlaw and Lexis, but other electronic resources for doing research.
Well, you know, I was pleased that I was able to use my educational background as a teacher with the certificate and everything to be trusted with teaching, basically being thrown in my first year and teaching in the legal research program.
In the first year program.
Not many people get that opportunity to do that. So after 5 or 6 years of doing that, you and SIU gave me the chance to propose to the faculty a new course, the Advanced Electronic Legal Research course, because I felt that a lot of the electronic material, a lot of the web material wasn't getting covered in the first year course because there just wasn't enough time. And so we offered it as an elective basis. Primarily third years took it, and it was initially offered with a number of evaluation options. I've done Pathfinders, I've done final exam, I've done papers, etc. And it was groundbreaking in a lot of ways. We were one of the first schools to have that particular course. Nowadays, it's not so much a separate course as it's just sort of rolled into your basic courses. But that was back when there was still a major difference between print and electronic, and we're still covering a lot of the print resources back in the first year. And now it's pretty much basically you're taking either melded or you're just teaching advanced electronic legal research as your basic research course these days. At least that's what it seems to me.
From 2006 to 2008, you served as Associate Law Library Director at SIU, advancing from the Director of Information Technology. And then, just as you were about to take office as AALL President in July 2008, you achieved what you've already identified as one of your long-term goals, and you became Law Library Director at Tulane. Was it a difficult transition for you to move from working, I'll call it, in the trenches, working the reference desk, etc., to library administration, both as associate director and then as director at Tulane?
No, not really. And I can basically, when it rains, it pours. And my goal had been to be AAA president and also be the director. And I thought, well, great, just great. It'll happen at the same time if this occurs. But fortunately, 20 years at one place really gave me the confidence to take on a new job without having to relearn everything. And also, you gave me the training that made me realize that I could do this job even without having the additional responsibilities of being ALL president. And you also were the mentor in that regard, having served as president yourself. Was it 97, 98?
96, 97.
96, 97. So I had that experience working with you as you served as president, and I saw what the demands were there, and I figured I could handle it. When I got to Tulane in 2008, there is an active library director listserv that basically was more active back then than I think it is now, but there were a lot of new directors around that time, and they were asking a lot of questions that I thought, you should already know this, and I knew it because I had been trained under you for all those years. So I found this wasn't the most difficult thing in the world to do the transition. Now, throw in AAL presidency at the same time, and maybe that was
and
a
we
little bit
understand
more.
why you don't have time for extra things.
But that was one of the best years of my life, was being president. It had been a goal. I'd served as chair of 2 SISs. I'd been a regional chapter president. I'd been on several committees and chaired committees, but my goal had always been be ALL president. Actually, my goal was to be ALL past president, but I knew that to become ALL past president, you had to actually put in the work as president.
Those rules.
So it was one of the best years of my life doing that, and all the travel that I was able to do, all the people I met, and being able to do the issues that and the initiatives that I had my year was just amazing. And part and parcel of that was before becoming vice president, it was hiring Kate Hagan, who really
As
has,
the ALL
as the ALL
executive
executive director, who has just been phenomenal for the association.
Very good. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about ALL and your professional service, but I did want to give you a chance before we go on to that and on to more specifics about Tulane. You worked 20 years at SIU. You've mentioned me mentoring you, and I appreciate your comments about that. And I want to go on record as saying I didn't give you anything. You earned everything that you received. But I wonder if you might want to talk a little bit about people and experiences that you had in those 20 years at SIU.
It was a pretty stable staff at SIU for many of those 20 years. We had a number of the same people who had worked, either had already been there for several years. You had been there 3 years before I started.
Correct.
But there were people like Laura Wendt, who was the head of public service associate director, who had already been there 10 years at least. Kathy Garner, who was eventually promoted to head of public services. Hedja Yu, who was the serials librarian, and Elizabeth Matthews was the cataloging librarian. So it was a pretty tight ship there for many years. Gradually, as people retired, there were some replacements. We seemed to have a revolving door in one sort of new reference.
The entry-level
reference position after I was promoted, but people like Gene McKnight, and then Adria Olney, and then Diane Murley sort of all filled that particular position. And then we hired Neil Pereira as a sort of cataloging librarian after Dr. Matthews retired, etc. So there were some credible people. Many of them were very good friends. Others were people that I looked up to. And others were people that I at least learned from. So it was something that really prepared me for dealing with staffs all over the board. And certainly Mildred Brown was your original assistant, and then Lou Paulsgrove, who you hired, and was a very good friend and was someone who was always supportive of the libraries.
We were very fortunate. Not only did we have that stable professional staff, but we also had a stable and very, very excellent support staff.
Like Pam Graham and Joan Meinhardt and Darla Smith and people like that who were really dedicated to serving students and serving the cataloging. So
Absolutely.
It was a very, very good time to be part of a team.
Let's talk a little bit about Tulane. You've been there for 6 years, and that's so from 2008. That's a period where there's been tremendous change, upheaval, you might even want to call it, in both legal education in general and in academic law librarianship in particular. What's it been like for you in your institution over that period of time, and what do you think about the future prospects for both?
Well, it was interesting going from a state school that oftentimes had budget cuts to a sort of somewhat different type of school, a school in the top 50 that draws nationally in their student body and has a pretty hefty tuition that sort of suggests that they're having some money brought in. Interesting enough, the library budget seemed pretty similar in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
so I was able to be as conservative as I knew how to be, given my experience with state rescissions and give backs and budget cuts and things like that. So I learned from the master in being able to say, let's wait on this particular purchase, et cetera, et cetera. But you're right, it has been a major sea change in how the legal profession is operating, with law firms cutting back, et cetera. And it took a little bit of time, but it certainly did hit the law schools probably 2009, 2010. And we are looking at sustained cuts today. I'm currently the chair of admissions and see how that's affecting admissions, not only our school but other places as well. What does it mean for law librarianship? It is always a profession where if you don't like change, it's not a good place for you, because something changes every day. You have to be flexible, but that's what makes it so exciting. is to be able to go with the flow and figure out, well, how am I going to meet this challenge? How am I going to balance the budget with ever-increasing resource costs and pressure from all over to reduce staff size? And I learned from the best in how to do that. So
Well, I appreciate that.
I think that it is a challenge, especially for new law librarians who are may not have the stability I had, at least in the first couple of years, to have the ability to learn about the profession without having to just jump in and change everything right away. But I think we're weathering it okay. It's just a matter of being able to anticipate what might happen, and for the things that you can't anticipate, just making sure that you can continue to provide the best service you know. And that's what's going to keep law librarianship effective and fresh and also relevant, is not so much about the sources, it's about the people and how the people provide what it is we as a profession do.
Well, I applaud your ability to remain excited and interested and enthusiastic about dealing with that change. I think that's one of the more difficult things for individuals who've been in the profession for a while, is that at some point that change goes from being exciting to being just enervating. So I think keeping that fresh outlook is great. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. You've been incredibly prolific in publishing, in teaching, in public speaking. You mentioned doing programs at both regional chapter meetings as well as national meetings. Throughout all of your career, you've been doing this, right? Really from the very beginning. I won't ask you to tell us about everything you've done, but I wonder if you can. You've talked a little bit about your enjoyment of teaching. I wonder if you might want to tell us a little bit about some of the aspects of scholarship and public speaking that what they've meant to you professionally.
Well, teaching was okay, but I also enjoyed getting out on the road and talking to other law librarians, especially collegially, but also in a more formalized project. And you helped in a lot of ways, because we had many times a dog and pony show that we would trot out. We've done programs on the image of librarians. We've done programs on ALL history. We've done programs where we're just talking about what's going to change in law librarianship over the years, and that really helped build my confidence in a lot of ways and allowed me to speak on my own. Sometimes I talk to librarians who get very nervous, and I just don't have that issue when I'm up in front of people, and certainly it's something you've got to get over if you're going to be AA law president, because you've got to be able to just speak off the cuff at any point and say what's on your mind and try to at least make sure that people know what are the benefits of membership in AA law. Having started as a tenure track library faculty position at Southern Illinois University, obviously scholarship was going to be important in order to get tenure and to stay at the job itself. And you basically gave some of the best advice I know that I repeat to this day. Write about something that you're interested in. If you have an idea, great. If you have an idea, hopefully somebody else will want to read about that idea and go from there. Don't just write because you think you have to write because you want to write. And that served me well. The first thing I wrote, besides some columns and some short pieces, was a study of ALL scholarship recipients, because I had been a scholarship recipient as well, and I had an idea that I wanted to know the people who got AALL scholarships, are they still law librarians, or had they become active in the profession? So, working with you and some of your advice, I designed a survey that we sent out to basically the 50 or so recipients that I could identify, and gradually over the course of the survey I identified about 25 more that I was able to also survey. I had a pretty good response rate. It was approximately 75%. Part of the fun was tracking down people who weren't listed as law librarians, so I wanted to find out, well, what had happened to them, and getting survey responses back from them. After doing that, I wrote an article summarizing the results, and it wasn't just enough to summarize the results, it was to come up with some sort of conclusions about it and make some recommendations about does the scholarship program need to change some things. And I made some recommendations about making sure that there was a little bit more tracking involved and perhaps having them sign an agreement that they would give the money back if they didn't do that. As a result of that article, it was published in LLJ, and I entered it in the call for papers and won back in 1990, back when there wasn't any money for said prizes. That's always
Still
been
a
one
sore
of the
point.
things. Still a sore point, but nonetheless, I was there and won for that, and also as a result of that was placed on the scholarship committee after the publication of that article. And I reckon
So it shows kind of the connection between doing one thing that leads to another.
getting your name out
within the
there, and
profession, absolutely.
Joan Hallen was chair of the scholarship committee at the time, and so I got to meet her and figure out, this is how committees work in AA.
And just to remind, so that's a 1990 call for papers winning article, and your first professional position was in 1998.
1988.
1988,
Right.
pardon me. So you're very quickly moving.
The progression was there. And then I did something very interesting. I took on a column for the Illinois Bar Journal, where I was writing about research sources you should know about. And that was something that really helped me not only learn about the Illinois sources that perhaps I didn't know about, but it gave me a statewide presence as well.
And it also made you write on a monthly basis,
Right.
Which, in my view, is one of the most important things for someone who wants to write, which is to write.
Right.
To build that
Correct.
confidence, to better your abilities to do it, etc. Very good. I don't want to cut you off if you have other things to add about teaching and scholarship.
Well, I continue to do it, obviously. It's something that has been ingrained in me, and I can't imagine that I won't continue to do it until I retire, which we'll see.
Okay, very good. James, you have served the law library professions in so many ways. I'm sure you're approaching some sort of ALL record as to the number of things you've done. So I'm not going to try to list everything. You've casually mentioned a few, but I can't help but identifying some of the notable contributions, which include chairing two special interest sections, the Computing Services and Social Responsibilities, being president of two chapters, the Mid-America Association of Law Libraries and the New Orleans chapter, serving 6 years on the ALL Executive Board, and of course leading ALL as its president in 2008-2009. You also just completed a term as chair of the AALS section of Law Libraries and Legal Information, and now entering what I have to term as your declining years, with quote marks. You are the editor of Law Library Journal since 2013. So, obviously professional services are very important to you. Can you put that importance into words and perhaps identify for us those professional contributions which have brought you the most satisfaction?
For me, it's what has made this job a profession as opposed to just merely a 9-to-5 job or an 8:30-to-5 job. Being able to reach out with colleagues throughout the country and indeed throughout the world has really meant the world to me as a law librarian, because I can pick up the phone or I can email or I can text someone if I need any assistance with anything, and that all came about because of AALL, being able to meet people, and that's really the beauty of the profession is the people. It's not so much the services, all those are important, the annual meeting is important, the education, but it's the people that's there. So that has really been the difference for me. And as I mentioned earlier, since I have no life outside of law librarianship,
But a very rich one within law librarianship.
the professional service has provided me with that. So in a lot of ways, it's become my family. So I've been very, very fortunate to be able to give back and to serve to some extent in the way that I've been able to do that. And I've been very grateful for those opportunities.
Well, again, on behalf of the membership, I want to thank you for that service, for sure. You served as ALL president in 2008 to 2009. You adopted Innovate as the theme of your year, and particularly the 2009 annual meeting in Washington, D.C. what do you consider to be some of the important initiatives and accomplishments of your presidential year?
Well, the recession was hitting right about the time that I became AA president. And even though my meeting was in Washington, D.C., we still had to be very careful about the costs and make sure that we had the attendance. And at the time when I was coming up with a theme, I really could not think of any better one-word theme, because I really wanted just one word, was innovate, because that's really what we're doing as law librarians, is being able to take the same old and do something so that we are showing our service. I was very fortunate in having Judy Gaskell as chair of my local arrangements chair.
She was the
Supreme Court law librarian as well, and also Paul George as my education chair. So I thought I picked quite well on the chairs for the committees themselves. I also was pretty much presented with an initiative that was not necessarily of my choosing, but it certainly made sense for me. AllNet, the website for AALL, needed a lot of work, and it hadn't been refreshed since it really had started. So that became my signature initiative, was AllNet, and making sure that we had committees that could provide advice on new companies, new versions of AllNet, and trying to come up with the money that it was going to take to change that. Another part of my initiative was one suggested to me by you, which was basically doing a revamp of member recognition in a lot of ways. Because yes, we recognize people with the Distinguished Service Award, and yes, we give out some awards, but it's somewhat limited. And it would be nice if we could recognize more members in a more meaningful way. And so I charged a special committee that you were part of. Were you chair?
I was part of Carolyn Ahern.
Carolyn was turned, and one other person.
Gail Warren.
Gail Warren was
Gail
part
Warren
of that
was
as well.
the chair,
Okay.
I believe.
And it was a way to say, what new ideas can we come up with that will recognize our hardworking members? And two very successful, among many, but two of the most successful initiatives that came out of that were our pins, our membership pins, our service year pins. Wearing my 20-year pin. I'm looking forward to getting a 30-year pin next year. And also the Hall of Fame, which had been an idea that had been kicked around for a while, but for whatever reason never got adopted until I said, okay, let's do this. And the idea of the Hall of Fame was the Gallagher Distinguished Service Award is a wonderful award, but it's typically presented at the end of your career as a law librarian, and it's 2 or 3 people maybe a year, sometimes not even that, maybe one or sometimes none. And there had to be a way. There were so many active people within the profession that are deserving recognition, and that's where the Hall of Fame idea came from. So,
well, that's a fabulous segue into really my last question. You've already mentioned winning the Call for Papers Award, and you received a Presidential Certificate of Appreciation presented by Joyce Janto in 2011. And this year, 2014, you are being inducted into the ALL Hall of Fame. And I think what you've just described epitomizes the presentation of the award to you, in that you have provided substantial service for many years, but you're not at the end of your career.
I hope not.
You're at mid-career, let's say. You're still making great contributions, and yet the association wants to honor not only you, but other people like you who are still contributing, but who have already done so much. So I wonder if you might want to just reflect a little bit on what such recognition through these awards, and particularly the Hall of Fame, means to you.
Well, initially I was just incredibly honored by being even nominated for it, because it was a very nice gesture to do. And when I found out I was getting it, I thought, cynically, great. I'm the person that basically was the president that created the Hall of Fame, and here I am getting in it. And some might say, well, that's still a little close. As we say in Louisiana, there's something going on there. But nonetheless, just looking at the list of who have been inducted in the Hall of Fame, not only through the pioneers, but in 2010 and is what an honor to be listed with people like Jack Ellenberger or Barbara Bentliff or A.J. Small or Hibernia, is it Turbeville, or Marion Gallagher, who I had the opportunity to meet at one of the AALL overheard at the bar programs and things like that. And it just is something that really makes me happy to be part of a profession that values, people that go a little bit more than just attend the annual meeting or maybe be part of a committee. And so that's something that I'm very proud of.
Well, congratulations. James, before we end our conversation, I want to make sure you have the opportunity to touch on any topics that are important to you, but which we might have missed. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude?
Just to thank you, Frank, for not only conducting this interview, but also being a mentor for the last 26 years. You were able to mention me when you got the Gallagher Award 2011, okay, and that was very touching. So, I don't know that I'll ever get the Gallagher Award, but I'd at least like to mention my thanks to you for basically being the person that launched my career and kept me going, especially when I might hit a roadblock in a writing deadline or get some snarky comment from someone about something that was said in a meeting presentation, or my jokes didn't go over well at some teaching event. But you were a steady presence and a great friend and a great mentor, so thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate those remarks, and I just want to say that it's easy to be a mentor when you have someone who is as dedicated and as talented as you are, but you're much more than that. You are a great friend. And so you talked about the importance of people in the profession and how that really is the critical aspect, and I couldn't agree more, and you're certainly in my book one of those people for sure. James Duggan, on behalf of Pat Kehoe and Michelle Wu and Dick Spinelli, my colleagues with the Oral History of Law Librarianship Project, I want to thank you for taking time to speak with us today about your experiences as a law librarian. Your remarks will be a valuable addition to the project and of interest to both current colleagues and to those who will join the profession in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.